Hello and welcome to our Blockchain for Real Estate webinar. It's Blockchain for Real Estate, Cryptography, Closings, Registries, and REITs. I'm Laura Dell. I'm a partner in Baker Hostetler's Washington, D.C. office. With me today is Robert Musiala, who's a counsel in our Chicago office. I'm going to give you, for those of you who are interested in CLE credit, our program today will last 1 hour and is approved for 1 hour of CLE credit in California, Colorado, Florida, Georgia, Illinois, New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Texas, and Washington. New Jersey credit is available via reciprocity. For all other states, attorneys can receive a certificate of attendance and electronic materials so they can file directly with CLE credentialing entities. During the course of the webinar, we'll share 2 codes that you'll need to enter into a brief CLE questionnaire immediately following the program's conclusion. Please stay logged into the presentation system for this questionnaire to appear. Please make sure to answer all the questions if you'd like us to submit for CLE on your behalf. If you have any questions during the presentation, you can type your questions in the bar on the right side of your screen in the questions area. We'll try our best to answer them at the end of the program, time permitting. If not, we'll follow up with you after the webinar to answer your questions. We will provide our contact information at the end of the program so you can contact us at any time with comments, suggestions, concerns, or questions. We especially like the good, happy comments, but we'll take all of them. We will also send an email to everyone in the next day or two with a recording of the webinar. So with that, let's talk about today's agenda. What are we going to cover? First, I think we address, why blockchain? Why are we talking about blockchain and why now? And certainly, why are we talking about blockchain's applications for the real estate industry and how do we even get there? In order to do that, we'll start with an introduction to blockchain so that we can understand a little bit about the technology and how it works, and how it's best used, and actually when it's not a good solution. And then we'll turn to blockchain applications for the real estate industry, where there seems to be a lot going on and some momentum really gathering for uses of the technology in a number of ways. So, what's blockchain? Why blockchain and why now? If you look at this slide's kind of busy, but it shows the testing and the pilots of this technology across a variety of industries. Down the right-hand side of the graph with the pie chart on it, they show a number of industries. And this comes from a Deloitte survey of their major clients from May of 2018, so just about a year ago, a little less than a year ago. And they were analyzing, what the process and the progress on blockchain engagements was across a number of industries and how their clients viewed the technology. So the industries down the right-hand side, they look at use in banking, communications, media and services, insurance, government, and some of those government uses are real estate related, manufacturing and natural resources, retail, securities, transportation, utilities, healthcare, education, and wholesale trade. So that's a lot of industries, experimenting with this new technology. And the survey that Deloitte conducted found that, of their major clients, a significant majority thought that the technology was scalable, a disruptor, and a priority for their industry. And at that point, I think a year ago, 43% said that it was a top 5 strategic priority. Be interesting to see what happens, when next time they survey. I think we do have some later survey information on another slide. The way the projects are focused, some of them you'll see down there in the middle, about 40% of the project focus is on digital records. And a lot of those digital records use cases some of them have to do with real estate. And then there are payment applications, which have to do sometimes with cryptocurrency. And there are some payment and tokenization applications for real estate as well. And then finally, they looked at participation in consortia of the big Deloitte clients, who, how many of them were actually doing something. It looked like 30% about a year ago had already joined, and 45% were likely to join one within the year. We'll see again if they have a new survey out where that went. But what that tells us is there's a lot of interest in the technology and a lot of companies and across a number of industries moving to at least test out various forms of adoption. So next slide, this is the next survey. This one's PwC and Deloitte both surveyed their clients in the end of August of last year. And again, some pretty good majorities of their clients are either actively involved with blockchain, big believers in the potential for blockchain and its compelling business use cases. And then a number of them anticipate replacing their current record-keeping systems with blockchain and see themselves at a competitive disadvantage if they don't adopt it. Okay, what's blockchain, right? What is it? What's all the noise about? What's everyone excited about? So there are any number of levels, I guess, at which blockchain technology can be described, from the very, very simple to the very, very technological. For those of you who are not, super techie, the easiest way to think about blockchain is as a ledger system, as a secure and immutable ledger system, which means that it's a ledger that you can write data to. You can write information on that ledger, but you can't take it off. You can't erase anything and say, no, that didn't happen. So it really is a list of essentially transactions or transfers of something from one participant in the blockchain to another. Taking it to a little bit more of a detailed explanation, a blockchain is a cryptographically secured transaction network and ledger that's shared among and verified by all computer nodes participating in a distributed system. So that's kind of a mouthful. Taking that apart into the sort of key components, we break it down into 4 key characteristics. One, a blockchain is a distributed network, and what that means is multiple independent computer nodes support the network and verify all the updates. It's not like a database that's just maintained on one computer or one sort of internal set of computers. Anybody who's participating in the blockchain can have an independent computer node that has access to the information and can verify it. 2, cryptography. And that means that the integrity and the security of the information that's stored on a blockchain, it's secured by public-private key cryptography. And Rob, in a minute, is going to explain the way cryptography works and how it secures the information on a blockchain. 3, it's immutable. As I said, immutable means you can write to it, but you can't take information off it. And the way that works is that every transaction that's recorded on a blockchain is linked to the previous transaction, which makes it practically impossible to alter the network data. If you change data in one block, it has to necessarily change data on the preceding and following blocks. So it's very hard to change without everything changing and without it being very easily identified and caught. So those first 3 characteristics, the distributed network, the cryptography, and the immutability, together enable the 4th key characteristic, which is disintermediation. And disintermediation means cutting out the middleman. It means that you can have peer-to-peer transactions without using a centralized authority as an intermediary. And that's, depicted visually on the next slide, which is kind of my favorite because it's very simple. A traditional centralized network, if you think about that spot in the middle where all the other lines, from other transactions from point to point must pass through that central spot, think of that as a bank or a government authority or somebody who has to validate each transaction. If you send money, even if you send it through, one of these electronic systems, it has to go through your bank. If you're validating your identity, usually it has to go through a government agency. That's how traditional centralized networks work. There's somebody in the middle that's validating and authorizing transactions or transfers of information. A distributed network, the one that looks kind of like a jungle gym or something at the playground for your kids, that's anybody who wants to send anything to anyone else can send it directly. There is no central authority, and that's really what makes blockchain technology different and enables a whole bunch of use cases that we're going to talk about that are different than what you can do with this traditional centralized network. So I'm going to turn it over to Rob to explain public-private key cryptography.
Thanks, Laura. So public-private key cryptography can be a complex topic. I like to explain it by using the example of what is arguably the first ever use of public-private key cryptography. Public-private key cryptography was formalized as a science in the 1970s, but it can arguably be traced all the way back to the time of Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar in 58 BC invented what is now known as the Caesar cipher. And this was a technique that Caesar created to encrypt Roman military communications. Here's how it worked. Before Caesar sent a general off into the field, he would first whisper a number into the general's ear, and that number would represent an alphabetic shift in forthcoming communications. So for example, if Caesar whispered the number 1 into the general's ear, then that would mean that in all forthcoming communications, the letter A would become B, B would become C, C would become D, and so on and so forth. And so Caesar would whisper this shift, this number, into the general's ear, and the only people who would know it would be Caesar and the general. He would then send the general out into the field, and then when it was time to write a message to the general, Caesar would write out the message in Latin, and he would then shift all the letters according to the agreed upon shift. He would then roll up that note, and he would stamp it with his seal of Caesar, and he would send that message along. And if you think about it, as that scroll is sort of making its way from Caesar to the general, in many ways it's kind of publicly available. Anyone sort of has access to it. People can see it, people can see the seal, people can even unroll it and look at the message, but nobody can read the message. But everyone knows that because it's got that seal of Caesar, if they're familiar with the seal of Caesar, they know that the message is from Caesar. And even if they're not familiar with the seal of Caesar, they at least know that every message with that particular seal on it is from the same person or entity. And everyone can see the message, but nobody can read it because they don't have the shifts needed to decode the message. And the only person that can decode that message is the general, who has that agreed upon shift and can use that code to decrypt the message. And fundamentally, this concept of the Caesar cipher was sort of the first ever use of public-private key cryptography, and it's fundamentally very similar to the way that public-private key cryptography is used to this day. The public key is that seal of Caesar. It's a unique identifier that shows that a particular message is from the same person or entity. And the private key is that shift, that agreed upon number, shifting the alphabetic characters that Caesar and the general would agree upon. And the private key is what is used to allow only the sender and the recipient of a message to unlock the contents of the message, even though the message is essentially publicly available and viewable by all others using a blockchain. And so that's basically how public-private key cryptography works, and fundamentally, again, works very much the same way that it did hundreds of years ago. All right, I'm going to stick with this example of the Caesar cipher to explain how computer nodes validate transactions on a blockchain network. So the Caesar cipher was used by the Roman military for almost 800 years until a very clever Arab mathematician named Al-Kindi came along, and Al-Kindi cracked the code. How did Al-Kindi crack the code? Well, very simply put, he applied logic and he applied mathematics and he did the work. What Al-Kindi did was he first analyzed the Latin language and he performed what's called a frequency analysis, where he ranked each letter in the Latin language according to how frequently that letter was used. So for example, he found that the letter E was the most commonly used letter in the Latin language. Then, when Al-Kindi came across a message that was encrypted by the Caesar cipher, he would first identify what is the most commonly used letter in that particular message. And he would take that letter and he would assume that that letter is the most commonly used letter in the Latin language. So he would assume that it's the letter E. And he would shift all the other letters accordingly. And if that didn't decrypt the message, he would then just go to the second most commonly used letter in the Latin language. And if that didn't work, he'd go to the third most commonly used letter, and so on and so forth. And he would attack this problem systematically in this way, in a way that applies logic and mathematics, until the message was decrypted. And this work that Al-Kindi did hundreds of years ago is fundamentally very similar to the work that computer nodes do to validate transactions on a blockchain network. It's just that the work that computer nodes are doing on a blockchain is hundreds or thousands or even hundreds of thousands of times more complicated. But essentially what the computer nodes on a blockchain are doing is they are solving complex cryptographic algorithms that, through those solutions to the algorithms, verify that a message is indeed what the sender and the recipient of the message say it is. And so that's a little bit of an introduction to how public-private key cryptography works. All right, so now let's talk about this concept of hashing and data immutability. So Laura talked about how transactions on a blockchain network are immutable through this process called hashing. So how does hashing work? Well, each block of transactions on a blockchain essentially contains three pieces. It contains the data, and it contains a hash. And a hash is just a unique string of letters and numbers. And there's a sample hash there at the bottom of this slide that's taken from the Bitcoin blockchain. And then each block also contains the hash of the previous block. And the hashes on a blockchain are related to each other logically, in the same way, fundamentally, that the letter B is logically related to the letter A, and the letter C logically follows the letter B, and so on and so forth. And so each block contains the hash of the previous block, and the data. And so what happens is, if you alter the data on the hash, and now I invite you to look along on this animated slide, you alter the data on a hash, well, that data is tied to the hash. And so if you alter the data in a block, that will alter the hash of that block. And if the hash gets altered, because it's logically related to the prior hash, it's going to alter the prior hash that's embedded in that same block. And when that happens, the hash from the current block, which is the prior hash of the next block, will alter that prior hash in the next block, which will then alter the current hash of that block, and then it'll also go backwards in time, where the hash of the prior block will be altered and the previous hash of the prior block will be altered. And so what happens is you get this domino effect where if you alter the data in one block, it will alter all the blocks in the blockchain because each block is linked through this hashing process. And when that happens, everyone will very quickly realize that the data has been altered, and the nodes supporting the blockchain will refuse to accept the altered data in that particular block, and they will refuse to verify and load that block onto the blockchain. And so that's a little bit about how this process of hashing works to create data immutability. And later on, Laura will talk a little bit about this concept of the 51% attack, which is a way that data could potentially be altered, but it's very, very difficult to do. And so we like to say that from a practical standpoint, blockchain data is unalterable or immutable. And so where does that leave us? To just give a little bit of an overview. So we have distributed networks that take control away from any single party. We have advanced public-private key cryptography that secures peer-to-peer transactions. And then we have hashing that makes the data immutable and makes it very trustworthy. And so you put all three of those together, and what's the result? The result is that we no longer need third parties to facilitate internet-based transactions, and we can now transact, arguably for the first time, authentic digital assets peer-to-peer. So I'll talk a little bit about how some of these concepts work in the Bitcoin network, and hopefully that will help them to become a little bit more clear. So Bitcoin was the world's first implementation of blockchain. And the way the Bitcoin blockchain works is, let's imagine Caesar is sending $100 to the general over the Bitcoin blockchain. Well, when Caesar sends that transaction is publicly available and everyone can see it. And Caesar knows that that $100 has been sent because it's no longer in his wallet, and he knows that because he has the private key needed to access and see what's in his wallet. And the general knows that he now has that $100 because he has the private key needed to access his wallet, and he can see that the money is now in his wallet. And then the question becomes, well, what if the general wants to then send that $100 to me? How can I be confident that he actually has that money? Well, the reason that I can be confident that the general actually has that money is because I know that in the Bitcoin network, there is a network of arguably hundreds of thousands of computer nodes now all over the world that are independently solving complex computer algorithms to effectively verify that, yes, that money is no longer in Caesar's wallet, and now it's in the general's wallet. So you might be asking yourself, why do these computer nodes all over the world do all this work? Well, the answer is in the Bitcoin network that they get paid. They get paid to do it. In the Bitcoin network, anyone can offer their computing resources to be a node on the network. We call these miners. And anyone can offer their computing resources to be a miner to help to verify transactions on the network. And for every transaction that's sent, miners all over the world compete to see who can verify the transaction first, who can solve the algorithm first. Whoever solves it first is rewarded with new Bitcoins, and so they're actually paid to do this. Then after that first miner is the winning miner and is the first to verify the transaction, all the other miners participating in the network race to double check that winning miner's work. And once 51% have all arrived at the same answer, at that point the transaction is timestamped and it is added to a network block in a way that is hashed to the prior block in a way that makes that transaction data from a practical standpoint immutable. So here in this slide, we've got 10 Al-Kindis all participating in the network, all racing to solve the transaction. The one that solves it first will get rewarded with new Bitcoins. Then once 6 out of the 10 have all gotten to the same answer, at that point the transaction is timestamped and added to the network via hashing. And so a couple more things about the Bitcoin network. Bitcoin solved the double spending problem. That's a problem that banks spend a lot of money on every year. And it basically goes like this. If I have $100 in my bank account, I can write a check for $100 to one person, and then I can go write a check for $100 to another person, and I can disappear before they both realize that I spent my money twice. And the reason why that happens is that the check isn't the actual money. The check is actually really just a message that is telling the banks to eventually move money from my account to someone else's. So Bitcoin, in contrast to a check, is more like digital cash. So it's like you're actually sending the actual asset, not a copy of the asset, and not a message related to the asset. In the context of things like documentation or other enterprise use cases, I like to use the example of sending an attachment over email. So if I log into my Gmail account and I attach a PowerPoint slide deck and I send it to Laura, well, once I hit that send button, now Laura has the slide deck, but I still have the slide deck. I have it on my hard drive, and I can go to my sent box and recover it. And actually now Google has the slide deck because Google was managing and facilitating that transaction. Well, imagine if when I attach that slide deck, imagine if as soon as I hit that send button, now Laura has the slide deck and she's the only person who has it. I no longer have it. I can't access it anywhere. And there's no third party in between the transaction that has it. Well, that's kind of how blockchain works. And with blockchain, we're sending a unique digital asset, not a copy of the asset, as we're familiar with from sort of the traditional internet architecture. All right, a couple more things about the Bitcoin network. So I talked about this concept of computer nodes verifying transactions. Well, they don't verify each transaction independently. What they actually do is they verify transactions in groups of transactions that are called blocks. So every 10 minutes, all of transactions that are broadcast to the Bitcoin network are aggregated in a group of transactions called a block, and the miners race to verify those blocks of transactions all together. And again, once the winning miner is the first to verify the block, then the rest of the miners all race to double check that miner's work. Once 51% of the computer nodes have all gotten to the same answer, the winning miner is rewarded, the block is timestamped, and it is linked to the prior block through this hashing process. And so that's where we get the word blockchain. The other thing I want to highlight about the Bitcoin network is that, again, every computer node on that network is retaining a full copy of the entire transaction ledger. So that if there were 10 nodes supporting a blockchain, if 9 of them got destroyed in a cyber attack, that final 10th remaining node would still have a copy of the entire network. And again, in the Bitcoin network, we have, by some counts, hundreds of thousands of times more processing power than even the largest cloud networks. And this arguably makes the Bitcoin network one of the most secure networks that the world has ever seen. And it makes blockchain networks in general very secure networks compared to some of the more traditional networks that we're currently familiar with. All right, so now let's turn to blockchain for enterprise. We talked about Bitcoin blockchain as a financial system. What about blockchain for business use? Well, Bitcoin came out and was released to the world in about the 2008-2009 timeframe. Over the next couple of years, technologists all over the world kind of became fascinated with Bitcoin. The code base for Bitcoin is open source, so it's publicly available. Anyone can view it. And after studying this code base for a couple of years, a lot of different technologists all over the world kind of came to the same two conclusions, kind of simple conclusions, but pretty groundbreaking. The first conclusion was that cryptocurrencies don't have to have anything to do with currency. So in other words, a blockchain doesn't have to be used to transfer a financial asset. It can be used to transfer any digital asset. And the second revelation was that blockchain technology didn't have to have anything to do with Bitcoin. You could create your own blockchain that was completely independent of the Bitcoin blockchain. And so around about 2015 in particular, we had a lot of these different blockchains arise. So I'll talk through a few of them. They're on this slide. Ripple is a startup that's using blockchain to help streamline back-end clearing and settlement systems for banks. So not using it to transfer. Yes.
Sorry, at least for me, the slides are not advancing. I'm not sure for everybody else, but I want to make sure everyone's on the right slide.
Okay. Do we see the blockchain for enterprise slide here?
There it is now. Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, so Ethereum I'll talk about in a minute. I call that public blockchain 2.0. Corda is a blockchain created by the R3 consortium, which is a consortium of over 100 banks all over the world. And they are using blockchain to essentially create what I would call a next generation SWIFT network. So a back-end clearing and settlement for international financial transactions. Hyperledger is the most commonly used blockchain for business enterprise applications. Hyperledger is hosted by the Linux Foundation, which is an open source foundation spearheaded by IBM, Intel, and many other brand name tech firms. There are various versions of Hyperledger, each sort of tailored to unique business applications. And then Quorum is JP Morgan's blockchain. Maybe some people have heard about this JPM coin, JP Morgan's cryptocurrency. Well, that runs on the Quorum blockchain. And JP Morgan was originally part of this R3 Corda consortium, and then they broke off and decided to kind of go it alone and build their own blockchain, and that's the Quorum blockchain. So those are just a few examples, but there are dozens of blockchains that are currently under development. And the point here is that there's a lot more to the story than just the Bitcoin blockchain. All right, so let's talk about another popular blockchain, and that's Ethereum. So Ethereum was financed by crowdfunding. It was launched in July 2015. And what the founders of Ethereum did was they copied the Bitcoin source code, and then they altered it. They tweaked it. And they altered it in a way that made it more friendly toward enterprise application development as opposed to a payment system, which is what Bitcoin was intended for. And that has become the Ethereum blockchain. Just like Bitcoin, Ethereum is publicly available. Anybody can donate to their computing processor in exchange for rewards and Ether tokens, and anyone can use it. And Ethereum has a couple different key characteristics that make it different from Bitcoin, that make it a little bit more applicable to business applications. And we've got three of those on the slide here. The first one is this concept of smart contracts. And a smart contract is essentially the ability to encode logic rules into a blockchain so that if one type of transaction happens, then another type of transaction automatically happens. And so smart contracts are a way for people to essentially streamline business processes by automating them. A second thing offered by Ethereum that's been getting a lot of news is this idea of token creation. So on the Ethereum blockchain, anyone can create their own unique cryptocurrency. These are called ERC20 tokens. And if anyone has heard of these initial coin offering events where people are creating these quote-unquote tokens for their businesses, most, if not all of these, are created on the Ethereum blockchain using ERC20 tokens. And so this is the ability to create your own, essentially, cryptocurrency unit and transfer and manage that cryptocurrency essentially for free with a little bit of cost on the Ethereum blockchain. And so this has this concept of ERC20 tokens has created the ability to build new business models, but it's also created a lot of really thorny legal challenges. And we'll get into a little bit of those today, but they've really created a lot of sort of controversy and challenges from a legal standpoint. And then finally, distributed autonomous organizations. This is still an emerging concept, but the idea is that by creating sort of a clever combination of smart contracts, one could potentially one day create what's called a DAO, a distributed autonomous organization, where you have sort of full pieces of business functions that are automated and that are making decisions according to predefined rules, maybe set by the business owners. And so this is, again, an emerging concept. We haven't seen any real-life implementations of a DAO, but it's something that the tech folks are really interested in and continue to work on. And we may eventually see it, maybe one day in the real estate context, where you're automating certain transactions that are involving multiple parties. Okay, a little bit more about blockchain for enterprise. One thing we like to highlight when we talk about blockchain for enterprise use is that it's really important to think about when does blockchain make sense and when does it not make sense. And there are a lot of blockchain projects that fail, and I would argue that in a lot of cases, blockchain projects fail because they're using blockchain to try to solve something where blockchain isn't necessarily the right solution. And so this is a test that Laura and I have that we use to sort of evaluate whether blockchain might be a good solution. So blockchain can drive efficiencies in situations where you have multiple independent business entities, and all those independent entities, number one, they rely on and they update the same data set. Number two, they would mutually benefit from increasing the speed of updates to that data set. Number three, they would each like to independently verify updates to the data set as opposed to trusting someone else to verify. Number four, they would each save money by cutting out the data intermediary. And then number five, they would share an interest in potentially automating certain transactions through smart contracts. And if you have all five of these elements, blockchain might be a good solution for your business problem. If you don't have all five of these, and certainly if you only have two or three, then blockchain probably isn't a good solution, and you should probably look to just a good old-fashioned database. Another concept I want to highlight is that another thing to think about if you're thinking about blockchain is whether you should look toward a public permissionless blockchain or a private permission blockchain, or somewhere in between. So a public permissionless blockchain is something like Bitcoin or Ethereum, where it's permissionless in the sense that anyone can contribute computing resources and host a node supporting the network. And it's public in the sense that anyone can use it. In contrast, a private permission blockchain is invite only in terms of who can contribute computing resources as a node supporting the network, and it's invite only in terms of who can use it. And then there's some blockchains that are in between. So there's a concept of, for example, a public permission blockchain where it's permissioned in the sense that only certain people can devote the computing resources and host that network, but it would be public in the sense that anyone can actually use it. And we'll see that, I think, especially in the use case of property registries, a public permission blockchain very well might be the way to go. All right, so just a little bit more about smart contracts. This is an example I like to use to try to explain more about how a smart contract could work. This is from a real-life pilot by a French company called Fizzy. And what they did is they created a smart contract for airline insurance, such that in the moment that an airline notifies an insurance carrier of a delay in a flight, there's a smart contract held by and managed by the insurance carrier that will automatically send a refund payment through the ticket holder's credit card. And so it's automating the function of the insurance carrier in that situation so that the ticket holder will get notice of the flight delay and simultaneously will see that payment refund on their credit card. And so that's an example of how a smart contract might work in the real world. Okay, Laura, I'm going to now turn it back to you to tell us about self-sovereign identity.
Thanks, Rob. So just a few more concepts that are sort of, use cases and issues with blockchain in general, and then we'll turn to real estate applications. So self-sovereign identity is one of my, actually one of the things that got me really interested in blockchain in the first place. It's this idea that that using blockchain technology, individuals can obtain and can retain control over their own identity data. So it's a way to think about, getting around the world where we all live in now, with username and passwords to identify ourselves every time we go anywhere on the internet, and creating vast troves of data and sharing vast troves of data with all these, entities and companies and whoever we interact with on the internet. And then those vast troves of data are either hacked or maybe misused by the organization or monetized or whatever. The idea of self-sovereign identity is to give the control of the identity back to the individual. And it allows the individual to digitally provide and sign in, again, with the public-private key cryptography, to provide only the minimum personal information that's needed to complete a transaction. So here you've got Elvis's driver's license, but I always kind of talk about it as if it's me, and I, go to a bar and I'd like to get a glass of wine after giving my webinar, which I don't usually do in the middle of the day, just as an aside. But if I go to a bar and I give the bartender I ask for a glass of wine, and they say, well, do you have ID? Now you give them your driver's license, and it says lots of things about you. In my case, it says that I'm substantially over 21, but it also says how tall I am and how much I weigh and where I live and whether I need corrective lenses and whether I'm licensed to drive a car or maybe a truck or a motorcycle. It's a lot of information that the bartender does not need, and I don't necessarily need for him or her or anybody else to have. So with self-sovereign identity, the idea is that you can validate simply a validator of the key part of information that you have. It allows you to digitally sign that says, I am over 21 years old, rather than I'm Laura and here's where I live and here's how much I weigh and I'm over 21, because this is exactly how old I am. So it's a really amazing use case for blockchain, and we'll see it employed or as a key part of some of these real estate related use cases, including around property records. But it's also a great answer, and we won't get into it so much on this webinar, for people around the world who don't have government issued ID. The UN and other organizations are looking at self-sovereign identity as an answer to providing identity to people who don't, have documents now. Moving on quickly to vulnerabilities and security of blockchain solutions. People say, oh, they're really secure. The Bitcoin blockchain has never been hacked. It has not. But you probably also heard of thefts of Bitcoin and hacks of things like Bitcoin exchanges or people's wallets. Those do happen. There are sort of two primary areas of cybersecurity concern for blockchain, and these will be the same, essentially, whether it's a Bitcoin-related transaction or an enterprise transaction. They're the same kinds of vulnerabilities with the technology. So one is wallet attacks. If you can hack into someone's wallet, which is the way they control and sign with their keys to move assets or share information, then that information can be diverted, because essentially the attacker has control of the key that controls what happens to that information. The other one, when Rob was talking about the miners and talking about if 51% of them agree, then a transaction is validated and entered onto the chain. So there's something called a 51% attack. And that's where if some entity or consortium or conspiracy takes control of 51% or more of the network's processing power of the computers on the network, then an attacker can manipulate the blockchain by validating transactions that are actually invalid. There are ways around that. And some of them have to do with setting, if you're creating your own private permission blockchain, you can set the number of nodes that have to validate a transaction kind of anywhere you want. So you could make it a super majority. You could make it 70% or 90% if you wanted, and make it harder, but it doesn't address the fundamental insecurity, which is that, if there is a conspiracy or somebody gets control of majority of the computers on the network, transactions can be validated that shouldn't be. Finally, quickly, a couple of words about U.S. and foreign regulation. Most of this is related to cryptocurrencies, which may not be totally central to some of the real estate uses, but there are a couple of things to think about. Blockchain is an emerging technology. Cryptocurrencies are emerging technologies and emerging assets. And what happens is things that emerge technologically come out faster than the law. Every time. Technology moves faster than law does. So once these things emerged and were invented, the law tried to catch up and figure out, well, what do we think of them? How do we classify them? And the way jurisdiction works, especially among federal agencies, is they have limited sort of subject matter jurisdiction. So what you see is a bunch of federal regulators on this slide. FinCEN, which is the Treasury Department Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, has jurisdiction over enforcing financial crimes. They, not surprisingly, define cryptocurrencies as money because their jurisdiction is over crimes involving money. The IRS, which is interested in taxing things around cryptocurrencies, says that they're property because the IRS has the ability to tax property. The CFTC, which is the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, not surprisingly again, thinks that they're commodities, and not to be left behind, the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, says that they're securities. That leads to a lot of inconsistent results. The one that's most relevant to the real estate uses we're going to be talking about is the SEC's guidance. When Rob was talking about the ability to generate your own token with Ethereum, that means anybody can generate their own cryptocurrency. If you sell that asset, if you sell a token to somebody and it essentially becomes an investment in your company, the SEC says that's a security. So there have been a lot of issues around, well, when can you create these tokens and not have them be securities? The SEC really doesn't have super clear guidance out there. There's been a lot of enforcement actions. And that confusion and regulatory uncertainty has led to a little bit of hesitation and some slower rollouts in some ways around tokenized assets, including in the real estate world, because of concerns that they would be classified as securities by the SEC and cause regulatory and enforcement problems for those who are issuing them. So finally, we come to CLE number 1, CLE slide. The code here is BH block 1, and that's BH block 1. It's all one word, the number 1. So let's talk about some applications for blockchain in the real estate industry. This is an area where there are emerging use cases worldwide, and a fair amount of enthusiasm for what's going on. So this is one of my favorite slides, the trajectory of blockchain adoption. It's from Gartner, and it shows on the bottom axis the stages of adoption of new technologies and of new solutions. And the solutions, the stages run from innovation trigger, where things start, something is innovative and new, and to the next one is what they call the peak of inflated expectations. That's when everyone thinks this is awesome, it's going to solve the world's problems. You then, however, move into the trough of disillusionment. Maybe this isn't so awesome, maybe it doesn't solve all the problems. Finally, after you hit the real trough down there, you begin to emerge up the slope of enlightenment towards what they call the plateau of productivity. And what you'll see on the slide is that none of these use cases has even really a little bit, banking and investment had reached the trough of disillusionment, or the top of the trough. The rest of them were all still coming up in the inflated expectation stage, in the innovation trigger phase, where people are really excited. So keeping that in mind, we've got a ways to go. This technology may well solve a lot of problems, change a lot of things, but maybe not yet. So one of the first use cases that people got really excited about outside of the cryptocurrency world was in property registry. And there were pilots. In 2015, the Republic of Georgia became the first government to begin testing blockchain for land title registration. And if you think about it, an immutable record where you can see where property or anything changes hands, changes custody, and that record is permanent and can't be changed, that's a pretty good use case for land title, right? The system that was used in the Republic of Georgia was developed and implemented by the Bitfury group, and it registers land titles on a private blockchain and then makes the transactions verifiable on the public Bitcoin blockchain, so that people who are not, there is a privately controlled system, but other people have access to the records and can verify the land title. The project's currently in expansion phase that will include purchases and sales of land title, registration of new land title, demolition of property, mortgages and rentals, and notary services. So if you think about just doing a title search every time real estate changes hands, this is actually can really streamline and improve the efficiency and the verifiability of all those records. And that's particularly helpful in countries where there may have been some uncertainty, and there may be some uncertainty associated with political changes in power or other episodes around the verifiability of land title. So these property registry pilots and systems have really caught on around the world. Estonia, some of you may be familiar with Estonia, which has called itself the Digital Republic. They have integrated blockchain technology into all sorts of their public functions, including elections. But they are right now, as of last year, integrating blockchain digital ID system, which they use as their actual, talking about the back to the self-sovereign identity. They do have a digital identity system in Estonia, and they're trying to integrate it with their e-land registry for property records. Sweden has a national land registry that was announced last March to build a blockchain platform for real estate transfers. It's quite advanced, and they're really moving forward with it in Sweden. And then you see pilots in a whole bunch of other places, Vermont, Zambia, Ghana, Dubai, India, Australia. A lot of these are some of them are using the same startup, one called ChromaWay. Some of them are using local systems. Some of them are using larger, systems that are available worldwide. They're trying it a number of different ways, but it's becoming increasingly popular both in the U.S. and outside because it's such a verifiable and such an obvious improvement over current cumbersome land title systems. So I'm going to have Rob talk a little bit about exploring the details of the Illinois Blockchain and Distributed Ledger project, which is in Cook County, Illinois, which happens to be where Rob lives.
Thanks, Laura. And before I do that, I just want to highlight this great stat on this slide. According to a recent Moody's studies, blockchain has the potential to drive efficiencies in the title, transfer, and mortgage process that could result in annual savings of $840 million to $1.7 billion. So this is a very real opportunity. And as Laura mentioned, here in Cook County, Illinois, there was a pretty detailed pilot that went on, launched back in September 2016, to really see if they could figure this out. And so they went through a pilot, lasted several months, and they actually did load certain land titles onto a blockchain-based system. At least for a little while, those were publicly available for people to take a look at. And they're now kind of at a point where they are evaluating some of the results of that pilot project. And so here on the slide, we've got the 10 key findings that came out of this blockchain land registry pilot. So I'll just talk through them a little bit because I think they're very instructive. So the first finding, they found that, yes, indeed, blockchain can provide a method of record keeping that's resistant to alteration, even by government officials. So they've kind of verified this idea of data integrity and improved data authenticity on a blockchain. The second finding, the use of a blockchain with a proof of work consensus algorithm that requires expending massive amounts of electricity is not ideal for real estate record keeping. What does that mean? Well, you know how we talked about this idea of computer nodes all contributing processing power and getting rewarded with cryptocurrencies? Well, that process that was originated in the Bitcoin network, it's called proof of work, where you have the nodes that are solving complex algorithms. Well, proof of work actually takes up a lot of electricity, and there have been a couple different studies that have been published that essentially find that, at least as used in the current Bitcoin system, this proof of work system is sort of environmentally unsustainable because it uses more electricity than some small countries, even in the current Bitcoin blockchain. And so what Illinois found was that this idea of a proof of work consensus might not really work for a state and county-based property registry system. So one thing that I think we'll see some of these pilots turn to is maybe looking at what's called proof of stake consensus. We won't get into the details of that, but I will say that proof of stake essentially costs a lot less electricity. It's a lot easier to implement. It does sort of create a network that is not quite as distributed, where the power is not as decentralized as it might be in a proof of work network. But I think this is an issue that is going to have to be worked out before a real property registry system sort of goes live with a blockchain network. A couple more interesting findings. So they found that blockchain can provide a mechanism to combine the act of conveyance with the act of providing notice. So this is this idea of cutting out the middleman and sort of automating certain transactions. Blockchain's not an all or nothing approach. So I think that's something really key to keep in mind is that, I think some of these blockchain systems will work best when they're integrated with sort of traditional networks, traditional software systems and the like. Creating digital property abstracts can consolidate in one place property information that's currently spread across multiple government offices. So the idea there is that, with blockchain, we've got everyone using one record and everyone with the same level of visibility into the same record. And that can create, sort of remove a lot of inconsistencies and inefficiencies. Protecting property conveyances with public-private key cryptography can make unauthorized conveyances more difficult, protecting homeowners and lane holders. So that's a really good mechanism for preventing fraud in real estate transactions. But at the same time, this public-private key cryptography could potentially enable more secrecy in real estate transactions. So that's, I think, a really interesting finding, especially myself coming from a background in anti-money laundering. There's a lot of risks related there, related to increasing privacy in real estate. And that's something that Illinois called out as something important to deal with. They talked about tokenizing titles to property and some of the challenges that could create. I'll talk more about that in just a minute. They talked about how a blockchain system would be most optimal if it's distributed across all land record offices in Illinois. And so that gets to this concept of blockchain sort of being most effective when everyone is on board and everyone is kind of working together on the same blockchain-based system, as opposed to different counties, for example, using different blockchains. And then finally, it is not prudent to undertake any large conversion effort without knowing the commitment of elected officials. And that is, I think, a polite way of saying that it's going to take a lot of political support to get something like this off the ground in a live production environment. So here's another interesting study that was done by the New America Foundation. They're a think tank out of Washington, D.C. that's been doing a lot of cool research on blockchain for the public sector. So they did a study where they kind of laid out kind of a basic roadmap for how you might implement a blockchain property registry. And it starts from first recording transactions on a public blockchain, then moving to what they call a smart workflow, where blockchain is used to record some pieces of a transaction, not necessarily all of it. Then implementing smart contracts, maybe even for managing escrow payments. Then finally, actually replacing kind of the traditional centralized database with a permission blockchain. So again, invite only in terms of who's supporting that computer network. They talked about fractionalizing rights to property, and that gets to this concept of tokenizing property. Transactions taking place peer-to-peer, which is, again, cutting out the middleman and driving efficiencies. And then finally, they flagged this concept of interoperability, which is the idea that if we're going to have to find a way to get different blockchains to communicate with each other, especially if you can imagine different states having different blockchain-based property registry systems. So now I'll spend the next 3 slides just giving some highlights on some of the private sector initiatives that are going on in this area. So this slide gives some information on a couple different startups that are working on using blockchain to help cut costs in transaction closing. So one of them is called SafeChain. They're based out of Ohio. They've done a pilot with the Franklin County Recorder's Office. They are testing a blockchain-based platform that does kind of a variety of different things. One is to sort of increase the efficiency in title closings by streamlining transactions by putting some of that information on a blockchain and integrating it with what would be a blockchain property registry. And then they're also testing what they call SafeWire, which is a product that uses blockchain to help manage escrow accounts. CProp, I believe, is based out of Brooklyn, New York, and they're working on a similar solution. So they are using blockchain to help manage escrow accounts. They are looking to blockchain to help manage different documents related to real estate transactions. They've integrated traditional software into their solution, and I think that's a real key point to highlight because I think that's going to be a necessary part of solutions that work. And I think it's interesting to note that they're currently targeting foreign markets that they say have quote, less complex closing procedures, which is, it's just sort of an interesting thing to note. And I think we're seeing it across kind of the blockchain industry, where in some cases solutions are being piloted and are taking off more in jurisdictions that are, number one, friendly to blockchain as a technology, but also maybe that don't have modern property registries, and so are sort of more willing and able and capable of transitioning to a new system. All right, now I'll talk a little bit about tokenized real estate. This has been really popular as of late. There have been a couple big projects. On the left-hand side, the St. Regis Hotel in Aspen, Colorado, just last summer, went through a tokenized Reg D offering for accredited investors, where it essentially took the hotel, fractionalized it into tokens, blockchain-based tokens. I believe it was using Ethereum, and sold those tokens to accredited investors, and those tokens represent real shares in the property, as if it's kind of like a one-building REIT. Similarly, on the right-hand side, you've got Meridio, which is what they call a spoke, which is basically a business unit of a larger company, Consensus. Consensus is a business focused on creating solutions based on the Ethereum blockchain, and they are similar to the St. Regis example, working to build a system where they can tokenize properties. They are apparently working with Cushman & Wakefield to help identify properties that they can tokenize. And similar to the St. Regis model, they are currently offering these things only to accredited investors under Reg D of the securities laws. And you'll see that even the other two in the middle there, Alpha Point and Property Coin, are only offering their solutions under Reg D and Reg S exemptions under the securities laws. And that's because of this issue, of SEC compliance that Laura mentioned earlier. And so this is something where I think a lot more could happen if we could figure out how to navigate through the regulatory environment. But even still, we've got a lot of different solutions that are kind of looking at this stuff and that are very excited about the idea of tokenized real estate. Here's two more startups on this last slide. RealBlocks, doing the same thing, recently closed seed funding round, and then another hometown company here in Chicago, Building Block REIT, where they're trying to take this concept a couple steps further by actually, they're looking to create the first US-based real estate investment trust. So it's not just going to be one property, but several properties that would be managed and fractionalized, where their shares would be transferred and managed on an Ethereum-based blockchain system. And they're also looking to not only do that, but also to integrate blockchain into some of the business functions, like using smart contracts to enable automated dividend disbursement, using blockchain to help manage and track shareholder voting and other officer votes and other sort of business functions. So I think that's a really good example of how blockchain in the real estate industry can not only be used for tokenizing real estate, but within that model, you can use it for other sort of business processes as well. And so now, Laura, I'll turn it back to you to talk a little bit about legal considerations and to close us off.
Thanks, Rob. So yeah, we're lawyers, so we always come back at the end, at least in our own minds, to the legal considerations after we kind of take this whirlwind tour through the technology and some of the business use cases. So for the blockchain-based property registries, things to think about. Public permission blockchains are likely to be used, so it's going to, in order to have it be visible to everybody who needs to know where, the land title, they do need to use the public permission system. That's going to probably involve some cloud service agreements in terms of where that blockchain essentially is housed. It's not going to be running on somebody's private computer system. It'll probably be running on a cloud as a cloud solution. That it'll require some node cybersecurity standards and periodic reviews, or maybe more than periodic reviews of cybersecurity protections. There needs to be a agreed upon process for adding and removing nodes and who can participate. I mean, once you have a blockchain going with a certain number of participants, how does somebody leave or join, and what happens to the data that they create or have already created? And then thinking about how you select, renew, or change a chosen platform. Rob was talking about interoperability. What if a new solution comes out and it's better? You like it better? This is an evolving technology with lots of startups out there. How would you change it or update it? On the transaction closing issues, Couple quick issues: the acceptability of source data and documentation, transitioning from traditional signatures to self-sovereign identity validators, that validator I talked about with Elvis there. Remedies for technical failures. If your smart contract generates an irreversible transaction and closing costs get sent to the wrong place, what do you do? And then finally, on tokenized real estate, again, these token models do raise SEC concerns, and there are data privacy and security concerns, including compliance with things like GDPR and CCPA, which each involve, which is the new California Privacy Act, Consumer Privacy Act. They involve the right of deletion. And as we know, blockchains are immutable. So we'll leave you to think about those issues. You can contact me or Rob if you have any questions. Finally, our second CLE code, BH Block 2. And with that, we thank you for joining us and hope you'll come back for our next webinar on blockchain. We've been doing a series. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.